Hello again, friends. This is Mike, and welcome to the Soul Unleashed podcast. Today we're going to talk about something that's been in the news recently. I usually don't get into politics, and this isn't a political podcast, but I'm going to address something that happened in terms of the assassination attempt last week on the life of former President Donald Trump. And I want to look at three views of that incident because there's a lot of things going on about theology and whether or not it was a divine intervention event involved in his assassination. So like always, I don't have too many questions or too many answers, but I have a lot of questions, and that's what we'll talk about. Stand by. Hello again, friends and fellow truth seekers. Mike Nichols here with another episode of the Soul Unleashed podcast, where my goal is to help you with the questions you might have regarding the awakening of your soul, and particularly to help other left-brain types, like I think I am, ask the right questions in our search for deeper meaning to life. Ultimately, I want to help you unleash your soul from limiting beliefs and smothering paradigms. So let's talk about today's news and what's gone on. So as you all know, President Trump was speaking in Butler, Pennsylvania last Saturday night. There was an attempt made on his life. He just missed being killed, according to most reports, by just millimeters, missing his head. And so there have been a lot of news out there, a lot of reaction, especially on X and on TV and everything. And I try not to get wrapped up in that too much, but I was fascinated by all the theological takes about what had happened. Some of the reactions, many Trump supporters, for example, particularly Christian believers, asserted that the millimeter of difference between life and death for former President Trump was the work of God, an intervention, that an angel had protected him and caused Donald Trump to suddenly turn his head at the right instant, and the bullet just nicked his ear. Many people call it a miracle, and others assert that it is proof that Donald Trump should be president again, that that's kind of the will of God. So that caused me to wonder, of course, what do people who do religion for a profession think about this? And I saw a post by Father James Martin. He's a Catholic priest, a Jesuit. Generally says a lot of things I'm not really too cool with, but he happens to be far from a Trump supporter. But he said, quote, "I believe in God's grace. The problem here, however, is what about Mr. Comparatore, who was killed? Did God not care for him too? We must be careful in saying what God's will is, because the default interpretation, as here, is that God cares only about the people I care about," unquote. So I found that interesting, not necessarily helpful from a theological point of view, but that is kind of what people are saying, is that, because Donald Trump was spared, that, he's my guy kind of thing, and that's what God intends, and it's kind of like destiny. But unfortunately for Mr. Comparatore and his family, of course, he was killed. Another reaction, Joy Behar. Many of you know her on The View. I don't watch The View. I watch very little television, actually, but I saw a remark where she called Donald Trump, quote, very narcissistic, after Trump claimed that he had survived the assassination attempt because God was, quote, on his side. And then another Republican congresswoman, her name is Marjorie Taylor Greene, she claimed that an angel in the form of the American flag, the one that was hanging behind former President Trump, had appeared just before the bullet flew, kind of in the way that flag arranged itself, I guess, and that it was an angel that protected former President Trump. And then, of course, there's many reactions by atheists on X who simply say that there is no God, and you dinglings, and that it was all sheer happenstance. So what I want to do in this brief podcast is look at three ways of viewing this. One is biblical. What does the Bible say about intercessory prayer? What does the Bible say about God intervening, with angels? And secondly, a look at the stuff happens perspective. And then the third is a spiritualist or spiritually awakened point of view, which is what I've eventually come around to. So biblically, and the concept of intercessory prayer, my first thought was, what does the Bible say about this kind of stuff? I've done other podcasts before, about intercessory prayer. How does that work? Why does God answer some prayers and not others? But the Bible has plenty of examples of people interceding with God for a certain thing. Okay, in the Old Testament, there are people that intercede directly with God. In the New Testament, Christ or Jesus becomes the primary mediator between God and man, at least according to Christian and certainly Catholic concepts. But one biblical example, which is interesting, is Abraham interceding for Sodom and Gomorrah. This takes place in Genesis 18. And in this story, most of you know it, Abraham bargains with the Lord to keep him from destroying the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the Lord says, hey, I'm going to go down and check out this place. I hear it's a den of iniquity, and if I can find 50 righteous people, I won't destroy it. And Abraham goes, well, God, what if there's 5 less? What about 45? Would you destroy it for the sake of 5 less? And God said, okay, no problem. I won't destroy it for 45. And then Abraham keeps pushing his luck. What about 50? What about 40? He gets all the way down to 10. And God agrees not to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah if he could find 10 righteous people. Well, you guys know the story. There weren't 10 righteous people in the city, and God, in the Bible, destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. But that's a great example of someone interceding directly with God. Another example in the New Testament is Mary at the wedding feast at Cana. I've been to Cana. I was there last year, actually. At least I've been to Cana where people say Cana is. I mean, apparently there's some discussion about where exactly the city's located. I was in southern Lebanon at Cana. I think Israel also claims a city to be Cana. And whatever, there's no house there that they could say, hey, this was Cana. But there's a lot of drawings and rocks and stuff to say this is where it happened. But at the wedding feast at Cana, Mary said to Jesus, they have no wine. And Jesus says back to her, as you all know, woman, how does your concern affect me? My hour has not yet come. And then Mary instructed the servants to do whatever he tells you. A really interesting story. I've always wondered about that because, Mary was not the mother of the bride. I'm not sure what authority she had over the servants. And of course, Jesus doesn't say what his role is. He's apparently just a guest. But the servants, to their credit, did whatever they had to do. And of course, it became the first miracle for Jesus Christ. But that is an example of Mary kind of being an intercessor for people. And later on, I did a whole series on the apparitions of the Blessed Mother at different places around the world. But she describes herself as the intercessor for our concerns on this world through Jesus Christ to God. Anyway, that's a biblical example. The third example and final one I want to talk about in the Bible, which I thought was interesting also, is in Acts 12. And King Herod is not happy with the church, which is growing at the time. And so he decides to capture people that belong to the church and persecute them. And he had James, the brother of John, the Apostle John, put to death with the sword. And then when he saw that this met with approval among the Jews, who were also not big supporters of the Christian religion, of course, he also seized Peter. And this happened during a feast, a Jewish feast. And after arresting Peter, he put him in prison, and he had Peter guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. And Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover was over. So Peter was kept in prison, but what the Bible says is the church was earnestly praying to God for him. So this is an example of intercessory prayer. The church, relatively new, young church at the time, of course, was earnestly praying to God for Peter. Well, as the story goes, and many of you know it, the night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers. He was bound with 2 chains, and 2 sentries stood guard at the entrance. Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. The angel struck Peter on the side and woke him up and said, "Quick, get up." And the chains fell off of Peter's wrist. And the angel said to him, "Put on your clothes and sandals and wrap your cloak around yourself and follow me." And Peter went out and went outside the city, and then the angel left him. But what was interesting about this was a couple things. One is Peter said, quote, "Now I know without a doubt that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches." And I kind of contrasted this to, what former President Trump had said. He didn't say the exact same thing, obviously, but he said something like, God was involved, or God was part of whatever happened to me. And so I don't think it's narcissistic to say that God was involved or that God had saved you. Here's an example in the Bible of Peter saying kind of the same thing. Just as an aside, by the way, that story, I couldn't help but feel sorry for the soldiers, right? having been a soldier myself. 4 squads of 4 soldiers each were guarding Peter. They didn't know Peter from Adam. He was just some dude, and they were guarding him and doing their job. And next morning they wake up and Peter's gone. The chains are just laying there. The Bible says that Herod was enraged and that he killed all the soldiers. So, there's Peter's happy, yay Peter, yay God, but somebody paid the price for that happening, and that's just kind of a side note in the Bible. So that's the biblical basis and the biblical support for the fact that there is such a thing as an intercessory prayer, and that, yes, God does get involved in things. I mentioned, too, in another podcast when I was talking about angels, and there's a lot of examples in the Bible about angels being directly involved by God killing people in the Bible. I didn't realize there was that much going on. But anyway, there's a story in the Bible. I can't remember off the top of my head, but Israel is in the city of Jerusalem, and the Assyrians are outside the city, and they're about to storm the city and overwhelm it. And God sends an angel at night and kills 185,000 Assyrian soldiers overnight. And of course, the Syrian army is decimated, and they pull back, and it's a great victory for the Israelites. And at the time, I remember saying something like, it was great to be an Israelite that time, but it sucked to be an Assyrian, right? There's always somebody on the losing end of all these stories, but the Bible certainly does have examples of God intervening in what's going on in the world. So, second point of view, that was biblical. The second thing is kind of the atheist view, is that stuff happens. It just, there is no God. There is no overall one human or one super being overlooking the world who deigns to intervene in what's going on with our lives. It just happens. We were created out of electricity or something when the earth was formed, and it's all just happenstance. But I also found an interesting Christian perspective, which is kind of like that. I was looking for an atheist view, and I happened across an article by a gentleman named Brandon Ambrosino, and he's writing for a publication called The Christian Century. Christian Century bills itself as a Christian publication with a progressive point of view, which is fine. But what I found interesting about this is how Brandon Ambrosino approached the whole thing with Trump. And he was writing in response to what he also saw out there in terms of people saying God had intervened. He said, quote, "I have nothing but scorn for a divine being who has the power to make things turn out well, but only rarely chooses to do so. An omnipotent God who occasionally intervenes to decide elections, but sits back while entire species go extinct? No thanks," unquote. And I thought that was interesting. And then he also describes in the same article what he thinks God really is, or how God should be. I had problems with this, but I'll read it to you. This is a couple sentences of how he closed things. He said, "But a God who is with us, come what may, who is present with us as we roll the dice, who hopes along with us for the best outcomes, and who pledges to remain steadfastly ours even when everything falls apart, this is the God I believe in," unquote. And to me, that really struck me as stuff happens, okay? And God's just along for the ride, and doesn't intervene. And of course, it made me wonder what his concept about intercessory prayer might be. So that's the second perspective. The third perspective is the spiritualist view that I've come to embrace over the past couple of years as I've gone through this. First of all, I know that God exists. I believe that spirit exists. I know there is something beyond this life that we don't understand. And I was shaken awake after my son passed, and then I started to see the orbs. I'm not going to go into my whole story again, but most of you know it. And I started to see orbs, which led me to question things and want to know more and to read like crazy. And then I went to see mediums and people that connected me with, beyond a shadow of a doubt in my mind, that I was in actual communication with my son, because they were relaying things to me that were impossible for anybody to know. Not that anyone would care to research me on the internet before I went and saw a medium, but impossible for anybody to know. So I believe that God exists and that spirit exists and that there is an overall benevolent presence that has to do with us here on earth. And I also believe, the second thing is I believe that prayer has an impact, but we don't understand what that impact is. Why do I believe that? It's because I was told that as part of some of these sessions I had with my son and other spirit entities, that prayer does make a difference. Now, I don't know why or how that works. I believe prayer is some form of energy, but I don't know how God, if you will, I'm going to use the term God for this omnipotent spirit, but I don't know how that impact works, but I do believe that prayer does make a difference. Now, I guess my opinion, my point of view, A and B there, God exists and that prayer has an impact, is not very different from a traditional Christian view nor a Catholic view. But the next thing is not probably traditional, and that is I believe that it's all planned before we come into this incarnate existence. So I've read many books and discussed these kind of things in the sessions I've had with mediums. We have a soul contract, and our soul plans all these things before it comes into this existence. We don't just show up. We're not just born, pop into this world without some kind of plan or things that we need to work on. I read a book, Life Between Lives, and it talks about the detailed planning that goes into every soul that incarnates in this world. You have things that you want to work on. Other souls agree to do that with you. You agree that you're going to have certain exit points where you might leave this life. The final thing that is involved with all this is that free will is still in play. So you have choices that you can make, and there are guidelines as you come into this world that you know that you may or may not do this, you may or may not do that. But if I do this, this is going to happen. If I do this, this is going to happen. If I do this, you're going to do this. And so nothing happens by chance. I don't believe that Donald Trump turning his head by that little fraction of an instant was just accidental. I do believe that it was part of a plan. And as sad as it is, I do believe that the firefighter that was killed, Corey Comparatori, that was part of the plan. That was his soul plan. We can't pretend to understand why that happened, what the lessons were that he learned or his family had to learn from that, or his children or his family or the community. We have no idea what's involved with that. But, just like the 185,000 Syrians being killed, or, the soldiers being killed that were guarding St. Peter, there was a reason for that happening. We just don't know what that is, but it's part of the plan. It's very, very difficult to accept that. I had trouble accepting that with the loss of my son. I had prayed quite a bit. Obviously, my wife and I had prayed that he would survive, that he would recover from the liver disease that he had, and it just kept getting worse and worse. And everything we prayed for, I got angry with God because it didn't work out. He died. And then when my wife had her stroke and fall, and she was in a coma and everything, I was praying again to God, but this time knowing that maybe my prayers would not be answered. This time, to some extent, he did answer them. So I don't know, I've already said this, I don't know how intercessory prayer works or why it works, but I do believe that there is a plan. I do believe there's a reason why our son left when he did. In fact, in talking to him during different sessions with the medium, he told me as much, that he had done what he was sent here to accomplish to do, or he had accomplished what he was sent here to do, and he had made the decision at that point. As part of the soul contracts, one thing I've come to believe is that there are different points in our life where we may choose to leave. I thought my wife had chosen to leave when she was, we had decided to let her go, basically. I thought that was her choice to leave, and I think she decided to stay. But our son told me that he intended to leave at that point. He had done everything he was supposed to do in this life, and there were a lot of lessons that I learned from that. So that's the way I think things happen. And as terrible as it was for the people that were killed and wounded in Butler, Pennsylvania, I don't think it was happenstance. I don't think stuff happens. I think it was part of a plan. Does it mean that Donald Trump is supposed to be the next president? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't know. But I do know that whatever's happening is intended to happen. So that's all I want to share with you today. I think there's many ways to look at this. I just think that the spiritual way of looking at this, the spiritualist view, explains it the best for me, and I hope you'll consider some of the things that I just shared with you. Thank you. Appreciate you listening. You can reach me at mike@mikenicholas.com, or my website is simply mikenicholas.com. And thanks again for listening. Talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.